I figured out how to take 3 months of vacation a year with my family and still have the practice grow. I've been told if you have a good company culture and your staff is happy, that you'll be able to take time off. Well, that sounds good in theory, but what the heck is company culture? I had no idea. Well, over the past 30 years, I did discover company culture is how you do things in your office or how you do things anywhere. It's the formal and the informal systems that put together the experience. Well, you would think that that would be simple. It should be written down somewhere in a chiropractic office or in a medical office. This is what everybody's company culture is. It's actually not, because everybody's just a little bit different. I actually worked in many places prior to becoming a physical therapist. I worked at Nathan's Hot Dogs. I worked at Harmony Record Store, if you can imagine that, a record store. I was a nurse's aide in a nursing home. The one thing I can tell you for sure was every single one of them was completely different. So there is no standard way of company culture. But the other thing I also picked up was it seemed that whoever the boss at the time that was standing there was deciding how things should be, that's how things were. So for instance, when I worked at Nathan's Hot Dogs, there were managers there. There were a bunch of high school kids and there were managers. The problem is the managers were never there. They would walk around the mall and they would leave it to all of us high school kids and we did whatever we want. So I actually had the experience of absent managers and everybody doing what they want because there was no set of systems. I worked in other places, like a nursing home. There was absolutely a set of systems in the nursing home. And when the nurse was there and overseeing things, the systems were in. But when the nurse was down the hall, once again, it was a free-for-all because there was nobody, the nurse was the one that set the tone for the systems. So I got to thinking and I thought, okay, well, I've had some actually good experiences with bosses, and I've had some not so good experiences. Not so good being absent bosses or bosses that would get angry, things like that, right? But then I had good experience. I had bosses that helped me out, made my job easier, and I thought to myself, okay, if company culture is the thing that's gonna give me my freedom, well then I just need to decide, am I gonna be a good boss or a bad boss? I thought it was that simple. So I thought, well, of course I'm going to be a good boss because I had good experiences with good bosses, and I decided to be a good boss. And I set to being a good boss. Well, let me tell you how that worked out. I thought being a good boss was if somebody came to me with a problem, I would solve their problem for them. Okay. For instance, I had one of the therapy techs came to me and said, hey, I'd like the day off. It's my daughter's event at school, and I'd really like to be able to see my daughter. And I thought, okay, what does a good boss do? A good boss says, sure, take the day off, okay? Take the day off. And then I figured out the coverage for this therapy tech. The problem was there was nobody to cover. So I became the therapy tech for the day, along with being the front desk person. Because this is early on in our career when I was working the front desk with my husband in our office in Pennsylvania. So now I was running from the front desk to the therapy room, from the front desk to the therapy room. And I gotta tell you, the patient care was not that great that day, but I was being a good boss. That's what I thought, I was being a good boss. So then as time would move on, employees would come up and say, hey, it seems like there's garbage out in the parking lot. And I thought, okay, taking this on, what would a good boss do? Well, certainly not ask my employee to go clean up the parking lot. That's not a good boss. So I'd clean up the parking lot. I'd go out there and pick up the trash. Well, after a while, I realized, well, number one, I had no freedom because I was making every decision in the office and that I was doing everything in the office. And if somebody wanted time off, I was figuring out their time off. Well, there was no freedom in that. Not only was there no freedom in that, but there was no time for me to do what I needed to do on my job. And after a while, I realized this is not working, being a good boss. And I certainly didn't want to be a bad boss and be angry and bossy and tell everybody what to do. So I started looking around and I started saying, what is it that people who have big companies and have freedom have in place that I'm missing, right? It's certainly not the good boss, bad boss thing. And I looked and I realized that they actually had systems in place, just basic policy manuals in place on when to show up, all right? Sounds simple enough, right? Here's a policy that everybody shows up at 9 o'clock. When we didn't have that system, if people came in at 9:05, why was it such a big deal for me if they came in at 9:05? And then I'd get somebody to show up at 8:45 because they were early birds. They'd show up at 8:45. Other people would show up at 9:05 or 9:10 because they were always running late. But because I didn't have a system, I couldn't even have a conversation about it. And so then I realized, well, if I just have a set of systems on when people show up, just the basics, then everything will work well. So I put systems in place. And it did. It worked well in the sense that people understood when they needed to show up, when they needed to punch in. That worked well. But I was missing something. I was still missing something. And then I realized My policy manual that I had that was just very transactional, when you show up, your vacation time, was missing a whole element, which is how we treat each other and how we talk with each other and the experience we create for each other. So when I added those pieces to the manual, simple, very simple things, and we started to build a culture of camaraderie and helping each other. And that key element was how we all live together, work together, and support each other to be able to grow in our jobs. That piece was missing. And when I added that piece to our policy manual, that's when all of a sudden, boom, the teams aligned, and now I had a whole team happy and aligned in growing the business. So I go, okay, there's number one, was I had this set of systems that aligned a team. Then I had to say, okay, this is great, but how do I still take time? And then I realized I had 2 managers at the time. I trained them with the tool, that they were the implementers of this tool. And at that point, stepped back. Mike and I literally stepped back, and the managers were able to actually use the systems for, this is the culture of the business. Subscribe to our channel below, hit the like, and if you want to leave me a comment, leave a comment on how you liked the video or other things you'd like to hear.